So how would you build a macrocycle when the squat is the main lower body movement you want to improve? So that's a good question. So like, bear with me on the answer here. It's going to be a little bit long, but so first of all, so the squat, of all the main primary exercises, so like the 8 primary exercises that I like to use, the back squat is the one movement that you can endure the highest frequency. Okay, you can tolerate a higher frequency on the squat than you can other lifts. One of the reasons for it is simply like the dynamic and mobility component of the movement. There's a little bit more elastic component than the deadlift, for example. We're coming up off from a dead stop. But so that being said, whenever I want to improve the 1RM score of a lift, I always make sure that I train that lift in the intensification phases. So a macrocycle, so for me typically it's a 12-week block where I have accumulation 1, intensification 1, accumulation 2, intensification 2, where each and every one of these mesocycles are 3-week long. But the intensification, the nature of intensification is one of intensity. So the goal is you're trying to increase intensity, increase the load. So if I'm trying to improve the 1RM score of a lift, then it makes sense to train it in the intensification phase. So what I'll do is both intensification phases, I'll have squats for sure, without a doubt. But now, because I said that the squat can tolerate a higher frequency, what I like to do is that intensification phase, I'll double up on squat, so I'll back squat twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays. I like to do them on Tuesdays and Fridays because my typical split is upper 1, lower 1, off, upper 2, lower 2, and then the weekend off. And what I like is by doing your lower body on the Tuesday and Friday, which is the most demanding muscle group, it's always followed by a day of recovery, which facilitates your ability on the second squat workout to drive poundage up. So you're squatting on both of these days, usually obviously using rep schemes relevant to intensification phases where the average intensity will be a little bit higher. And now the 2 accumulation phases, on Tuesdays I will still back squat, okay? But now on the Friday I will do a front squat. Okay? The front squat will still, because it's so much more quad dominant, will still have some benefits to help with my back squat. But notice that now my entire 12 week, I'm not doing any type of conventional deadlift. But this is not a very big issue in terms of detraining my deadlift, if you want, simply because on my front squat days, on accumulation 1 and 2, on Fridays, my B series is always a specialty deadlift. So like a rack deadlift or something like that. So I'm still overloading the hip extensors with very high loads because of the shorter range of motion, but that shorter range of motion does not affect my recovery. And why is that so important? Because whenever you're trying to drive the poundage of the squat, it's really hard to have like really, really big increases on that movement if at the same time you're also training the deadlift. Because the conventional deadlift really trashes the lower back, but with a trashed lower back, it's such an important stabilizer on the squat that if the lower back is fatigued, your performance on the squat will diminish. So that's why I like to take the deadlift out when I want to prioritize the back squat to really force a positive, significant adaptation and strength on the squat. Okay, so that's pretty much the layout of the 12-week macrocycle where I'm focusing on improving the squat. Do I still implement the 90-degree principle during the hypertrophy cycles? Yes and no. It just depends on the outlook of your hypertrophy macro. So, for example, if you're using more of a standard hypertrophy macrocycle where your entire macrocycle, every mesocycle within it, will use a upper 1, lower 1, upper 2, lower 2 split, then I will use a 90-degree principle because your A's and B's are primary and assistance lift. But if you're using a more dramatic hypertrophy macro, where your accumulation phases, you're using like old school classic bodybuilding methods like trisets and giant sets and all, and you're using a split routine, then it's not really possible to use the 90-degree principle because you might have a chest and back day, then you might have a arms and shoulder day. So these would be your two upper body workouts. So then how can I really accomplish the task of 90-degree principle on a day that's it's only chest, right? So if I'm doing a bench press as my first exercise in a tricep, for example, it's not like I can do a overhead press for my A2 exercise of the tricep. Like it's not the same muscles per se, because the thing about these split routines and the accumulation phases, they're very muscle specific. Unlike in strength training, when I'm doing that upper 1, lower 1, upper 2, lower 2, I'm looking more at like motor patterns, movements, right? So it's like pressing, upper body pressing. I'm not necessarily just looking at muscles like you would with those hypertrophy cycles. So I just feel like if you're using split routines with bodybuilding type methods, you can't really use it. But if you decide to use just upper lower, then use it. You're always going to have more results, hypertrophy or strength, it doesn't matter. So what is my favorite posterior chain exercise? I love training the posterior chain. If you come to Kilo in Huntington Beach, like you'll see our gym, most of the machines, if you want, they're all posterior chain. We have three leg curl variations: kneeling, standing, lying. We have a horizontal back extension, incline back extension, reverse hyper, glute ham raise, the Nordic curl bench from Atlantis. So we're very well equipped because the posterior chain is so important. But with all of these, still my personal favorite is the safety bar standing good morning. That to me is the best by far, but even more so the inertia version. Okay, so what I like about the inertia version is you'll notice a lot of people, they have a hard time figuring out their range of motion. Okay, they might not go as low as they should, or they'll go as low as they should on rep 1, and then with each and every rep, the range of motion keeps decreasing and decreasing. Now what happens is if you do an inertia method, you go inside the power rack with that safety bar, which is very comfortable, by the way. That's why I like it. It just feels strong. It just feels very comfortable to just focus on extending the hips. But what happens is you first set what it is the range of motion that you want to train with that athlete, and then you adjust the side pins at that exact same height. So now the athlete, every time he's touching the pin, he's pausing on the pins for 2 seconds, maintaining tension, and then he's exploding back up. But then on the next rep, he needs to go back down onto the pins and pause again for 2 seconds and explode back up. So now you're forcing the athlete to always maintain the full range of motion that you previously determined on each and every rep. And on top of it, you're introducing a static overcome by dynamic contraction, which favors explosiveness. So that to me, it's by far the best and the one that makes me feel the strongest. How do I program the accumulation phases during the absolute strength macrocycle? So before we start, let's define absolute strength. So absolute strength, which by the way is my favorite outcome to train, it's basically it's a combination of training for strength, so you try to get as strong as you can while also adding muscle mass. Okay, so it's being as strong as possible irrespective of body weight, unlike relative strength, whereas you want to get as strong as possible in relation to your body weight. So you're trying not to put on weight and get as strong as you can. So, you know, for sports where you have weight classes or like sports like sprints or stuff like that, relative strength is more important. But something like somebody like a lineman or linebacker, running back, absolute strength is important as well. So now understanding this, now it's pretty simple. What you need to understand is for the most part, your intensification phases will typically use the relative strength quality intensity ranges, while the accumulation phases will either reach all the way to the hypertrophy strength quality range, or it might be the functional hypertrophy strength quality range. Okay, so your both accumulation will fall within these two categories. So that's what you need to understand. The accumulation phase, where you're focusing on volume, then you can afford to push the barrier of hypertrophy more. But then the intensification, you have to revert all the way back down to relative strength. And a response in absolute strength, it's never a matter of one mesocycle. It's the cumulative effect that you get from the 4 mesocycles within the macrocycle that gives you absolute strength. Okay, so absolute strength, it's not necessarily a strength quality per se, it's a training outcome. Okay, so that's the big picture. So again, just to conclude, accumulation phases, you use either hypertrophy or functional hypertrophy reps. Intensification phases, you use relative strength reps. If someone is unable to do a Nordic curl, what do I think of using the chin up or dip progression to remedy the weakness on the lift? I don't think it's going to work very well, because you have to understand that the only reason why that progression works on chins and dips is because we assume that the athlete can perform an eccentric contraction of 10 seconds as part of the first phase. But you're going to see very few people who cannot perform a Nordic curl that can also do a 10-second eccentric. So if you attempt to do the progression, but your eccentric contraction, like you're able to hold on like 4 or 5 seconds until midpoint and then you collapse, then the progression won't work. Like unless you're able to do like a fully controlled 10-second eccentric through the entire range, you're not going to get any benefits from that. So for me, what worked better to progress a Nordic curl is using a high pulley attachment with a rope, where you're using the weight of the pulley as a counterweight. So, you know, so you're holding onto the ropes, you're in the starting position of the Nordic curl, you're going down under control, and then the counterweight helps you going back up. And then as you're progressing, all you do is you reduce the load on the pulley so that the counterweight becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And then eventually you're going to be able to do some reps. Now you can also add at one point, once you become a little bit more proficient on it, there's no problem adding pauses eccentrically, you know, like especially like in the first early stages of it. But yeah, so overall I would use the high pulley way before I would attempt to do the chin up or dip progression for a Nordic curl.